Good evening, and thank you so much for being here for a very special One Book One community event, special Meet the Author event here at Darien Library. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and want to mention that these events are made possible by contributions made to our annual campaign. So thank you so much for your support, and encourage you to continue to give. I'd also like to thank Peggy Daneman, Diane Morrissey, and the entire Yale Club of Lower Fairfield County for co-sponsoring tonight's program, and we really appreciate the opportunity to work with you to bring such wonderful, amazing speakers to our community. It is with tremendous pleasure and joy that we welcome back to Darien Library our guest for tonight. In 2004, as our annual meeting speaker, he shared with us the vivid memories of his boyhood life growing up in a war-torn country, a spirited 1950s childhood that was then ravaged by the Cuban Revolution and Castro's regime. In his National Book Award winning memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, he captivated readers with his lyrical language, his spirituality, and his heartbreaking story of his separation from his family, as one of the 14,000 children who had been divided from their parents and airlifted to America with the promise of being reunited in freedom. In his recently published sequel, Learning to Die in Miami, we are reunited once again with this beloved author, who picks up where he had been dropped off literally, in a country that was completely foreign to him, but that was now his home, where survival meant learning to forget his past and Americanize his future. We see a new perspective on the small American things that we take for granted, like bowling, parades, our cuisine, and we also gain a new understanding of major moments in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis for one, through the eyes of a young Cuban boy. With humor and poignant reflection, he takes us through his struggles and triumphs in finding a balance between his two homelands. There's something we refer to here at the library as a huggable book. It's one in which a story comes so alive for you and the characters are so meaningful that when you get to the end, you're hesitant to finish that last page. And so you hug them because they mean so much to you. These are huggable books. And it is quite a thrill to have the author here with us tonight. After earning his PhD at Yale University in 1979, our guest taught at St. John's University in Minnesota for 2 years and at the University of Virginia for 15. He is now the T. Lawrence Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Please join me in welcoming back to Darien Library author Carlos Eire.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank first everyone and anyone who's responsible for bringing me here tonight, allowing me to be with you, and I want to thank you for being here on a Thursday evening. Beautiful weather, though, so that helps. I'll talk for about 35-40 minutes and then leave time for questions. And I just want to set this book in context. It's basically the first thing I need to do. But then I want to talk more specifically about a larger theme, which is the relationship between memory and history, and sort of the ethical dimension of being an eyewitness to history. So, to set it in context, I wrote Waiting for Snow in Havana in the year 2000. I had no plans to do that book. It just came. As some of you know, it came because of Elian Gonzalez, the little boy who was being sent back to Cuba. I could not stand the thought of him being sent back. It drove me insane. Because I knew, and every other Cuban exile knew, he would not be sent back to his father, which in fact is what happened. But of course, the press stopped reporting on that, so nobody knows. He never went back to his father. It drove me insane. And I thought, after being rebuffed by every major newspaper and magazine in the United States, when I wrote to them and said, you know, you ought to do a story about the airlift that brought 14,000 kids and the way in which the Cuban government separated intentionally thousands of children from their parents, you ought to do this. I never got a single acknowledgement. I thought, I need to write something. So, Waiting for Snow in Havana came out, and much to my surprise, it did everything I wanted it to do and more. And I had no plans to write a follow-up, none whatsoever. And people would ask me, oh, of course you're going to continue the story, and I'd say, no, the rest is not interesting, or I just can't do it. Well, it came in the most unexpected place, in the most unexpected way. It came in the summer of 2009 in Prague, Czech Republic. I'm traveling with a Yale alumni group. It was a boat trip up the Elbe River from Prague to Berlin. At some point north of Magdeburg, you make a right turn on a canal to Berlin. But here I am in Prague, the place where my parents didn't want me to end up. As a matter of fact, I can't tell you how many times my parents said, "We're sending you to the United States so you won't end up in Prague." And there I am. And everything is beautiful. Prague is so heartbreakingly beautiful. And it's 20 years for them since they got rid of a monstrous government. But there I am. And I'm standing before a poster for the Museum of Communism. And I ask myself, if I go in this museum, am I a visitor or an exhibit? And there started a whole chain like dominoes falling one after the other. I began to feel my exile-ness, if that's a term. I felt more like an exile in Prague than I ever have in my whole life, because there was this distance to cover, and seeing a place that has gotten rid of the same kind of monstrous government that is still in place in Cuba made it all the worse. And as I'm traveling through East Germany, former East Germany, I finally get to Berlin and stand by the few remains of the Berlin Wall. It all came together. All came together in a very strange way. In the same way I felt compelled to talk about my childhood in Waiting for Snow, I felt compelled to write about my exile. I also had 3 kids to put through college. So I knew no academic book was going to help me with that. But seriously, it was just something that came and took over me the same way I wrote this book, the same way that I wrote Waiting for Snow, which is I wrote it in one summer. At night, I'd begin writing at 9 or 10 at night and write till I was tired. Sometimes the sun was coming up. I still remember a New Yorker cartoon. I can't remember who the cartoonist was. The guy cooking hamburgers in the backyard. He's got an enormous pile of hamburgers behind him. And the caption is, "Sun up already?" That's how I felt writing both of these books. Time stood still. So I wrote it, and here it is, and it takes the story from the minute I arrive in Miami until I reunite with my mom in Chicago. But this book has a lot more flash forwards. It has very few flashbacks. It has a lot of flash forwards that anchor my exile experience to my adult life. But I'd like to read to you one chapter, or not the whole chapter, just a little section from one chapter which details my experience in elementary school in Miami. Everglades Elementary School. Anyone here from Miami who knows Everglades Elementary? Sometimes there's somebody in the audience who actually does. No one. Yeah. Back then it was kind of close to the Everglades. Now it's right smack in the middle of Miami. But here's what happened to us Cuban kids who came in. We were thrown into these classrooms where the entire day was devoted to teaching us English, so that we would be prepared to enter the real classroom with the other kids. And that's what they did. No bilingual crap. Learn English, get into the real classroom. And it worked beautifully. And I wish it still worked that way. This is my coming to the English-speaking classroom. Another kind of item to set it up. When we arrived, those of us who came on the airlift were taken to camps. The camps were distribution centers, basically, to hold us, holding tanks to send us somewhere else. My brother ended up with one foster family. I ended up with a different foster family. They were friends with each other, but they lived about 20 blocks apart in Miami. Two wonderful, loving Jewish families. So I learned English and Yiddish simultaneously. Although no one told me that some of these words were not English. So I thought I was just learning English. Then when I ended up moving to the Midwest of Bloomington, Illinois, home of Adlai Stevenson and Eureka vacuum cleaners, and I'd say a Yiddish word, nobody knew what I was talking about. I was very puzzled. Very, very puzzled. So, anyway, without less of an introduction, is chapter 9. Part of it. Teach me how to swear in Spanish. I can't add up how many times I've had this request already. Everyone wants to learn all the bad words in Spanish, even the girls. This puts me in a tight spot where uttering bad words is against the first commandment and an entry ticket to hell. So if I teach bad words to anyone, I'm endangering not only my eternal fate, but also theirs. And that makes my sin doubly worse. And if I say nothing, they'll just keep pestering me. I tried that, and I know that silence won't work. Plus, if I refuse, I'll be totally uncool, worse than a nerd. What's a boy to do? Toss them a bone, maybe. Remolacha, I say. What's that? Oh, it's the Spanish word for sex, you know. The really dirty word with the F. Give me more. Okay, how about this? Méteme una patada en las nalgas. What's that? It means go have sex with yourself. You know, another version of the big bad F word. Thanks, Charles. Thanks a lot. That's great. I'm Charles already. I went from being Carlos to being Charles. Then later I would become Charlie. And eventually in Bloomington, Illinois, I would be Chuck. And even worse than that, because, you know, Eire is my mother's surname. In Miami and in Bloomington, and everywhere I went, I was told, only one surname per customer, buddy. You can only have one surname, so, you know, which parent do you betray, your father or your mother? So I went by my father's surname, Nieto, which, of course, no one could pronounce in Bloomington. It was Nito. So for 2 years of my life, I was Chuck Nito. So anyway, back to the narrative. I don't tell this kid that what I've just taught him to say is the Spanish word for the vegetable beet and kick my butt. Monty Python guys would do that trick later with their Hungarian phrase book. I think they stole it from Cubans. But I'm in this school, and I have some trouble. People keep asking me all sorts of questions that I find extremely odd, like what it felt like to wear shoes for the first time. If I rode donkeys all the time. Surprise, you had televisions? Then I look at my geography and history books, and I realize that that's where all the ignorance is coming from, is from the books. And I've told several of our graduate students in American history that make a wonderful dissertation is the way in which other countries are represented in textbooks from the 50s and 60s. Because the level of disconnect between the real place and what we had in those books is so immense, it still hangs over all of us. But anyway, it's Halloween. And Halloween, as some of you in this room remember, Halloween 1962 coincided with the missile crisis. Yes, yeah, you all know the missile crisis. But I couldn't care less about the missile crisis. I was going trick-or-treating. And I loved the fact that in this country, it was a constitutional right for every child to vandalize neighbors' homes. And I went trick-or-treating and had a wonderful time and vandalized to my childish delight, but still had to deal with this fact that not exactly everything was going right at school. The kids made fun of my accent. And I won't read that part, but I raised my hand in class first week to answer a question, and I thought I had said, well, that's easy. But no, everyone started laughing at me. Easy. That's what I said. Easy. That's easy. And they all started making fun of me, so I commit myself at that moment in the fall of 1962 to losing my accent. Because up to that time, I thought Desi Arnaz spoke perfect English. So I seize on the one new and not so new television shows, which to my mind had the finest American accent. Beverly Hillbillies and the Andy Griffith Show. And I dedicate myself to learning Southern, which I can still do. But not everything is going right. It's not just the language and the teasing. It's the fact that I start getting threats, I start getting into fights, my bicycle is destroyed. And I get asked even more stupid questions like, why do all Cubans have big lips? So I encounter this kind of cultural dissonance. End of the chapter. Now all I need to become a real American is to become Jewish and have a bar mitzvah. It's what I thought was normal. What else could I think living with a Jewish family? By the way, they forced me to go to church and gave me money to put into the collection plate. My brother and I thought we had it made. Oh, we'll have to go to church while we're living with these people. They forced us. So anyway, all around me, boys my age were preparing for their entry into manhood, and here I was just floundering, pedaling my bike to St. Brendan's on Sunday. My 12th birthday is approaching, less than a month after Halloween. I know I won't get a bar mitzvah, but I'd sure like to have one about a year from now. That would make everything all right, even if I have to wear one of those stupid little caps that refuse to stay put on the back of your head. That ritual might even cure me of my accent and give me one more chance to go out on Halloween. Next year at this time, I won't be a man yet. No. I'll still be a boy, barely a boy, but nonetheless with 3 weeks to spare. A very lucky boy, with mambo lips and all, with no bones through his nose, who can teach curious American kids how to cuss incorrectly in Spanish as he pines for fjords and bar mitzvahs, with no concern whatsoever for the pain that comes with circumcision or with finding your front door keyhole has been carefully jammed up with bazooka bubblegum. Hey, Charles, what's the bad word of the day? Give me a really bad one this time. Really, really bad. Berenjenas. Eggplants. What's that? Oh, it's a very nasty way of saying breasts. Yow. How about one more? Of course, no kid really talked that way, but it's more fun to read it that way. How about one more? Me encantaría saborear tu flema. I would love to savor your phlegm. That sounds even worse. What is it? Oh, it's a very, I'll do my accent that I had then. It's a very bad way of saying, I love to kiss you all over. Thanks, Charles. You Cubans have such dirty minds. Thanks. You bet. It's easy for us. It's all we can do in our grass huts, you know. What? Vete al carajo, cabrón. Go to hell, you bastard. Say what? Nothing. Never mind. Nothing, never mind. I know I've just bought myself an empty ticket to hell, especially since I've stopped going to confession. But I don't give a damn. Hell, I don't give a flying remolacha. Somehow, in some half-assed way, I figured out that heaven and hell intersect all the time here in Miami. So, learning to die. The AARP showed great interest in my book when it was announced. They actually interviewed me for their Spanish and English radio shows. And then they found out what the book was about, and I think they dropped all their interest in it. What is learning to die? The title came to me as I was about 1/3 of the way through the book, because I realized that this is what I was doing, telling this narrative of what it's like to come as a child without your parents to a strange country and then be bounced around from place to place. Every immigrant dies upon arrival. You have to die, and of course, hidden subtext, reborn. But actually, I realized about 1/3 into the book that it's not just immigrants, all of us. Life is a series of deaths. We all die numerous times in a lifetime. Some of these are gradual, painful. Some of them are gradual and joyful. Some of them are sudden and unexpected and unwanted, but we all die many times. And an older audience appreciates when I say anyone who has gotten married has died. See, and you laugh because you know. Actually, one audience member once raised his hand and said, "More than once." Learning to live is learning to die. But especially a child exile or child immigrant or refugee. I realized after I had finished the book that the title was perfect and I had to stick with it even though it could give the wrong impression. Because everyone, even if they continue to live in the house in which they were born for the rest of their life, will always be an exile from childhood. Childhood is a country to which none of us can ever return. It is a death and a rebirth. Not so sudden, perhaps, but for those of us who came on the Pedro Pan airlift, we all died instantly. We lost our childhood instantly. Mine was lost, oddly enough, on April 6th, 1962. Yesterday was my 49th anniversary. And I consider myself as having two birthdays. My real birthday and April 6th. Because it is a death. And when people have asked me, actually before I wrote the book, and one of my obsessions is death, the afterlife. I just published a book last year, A Very Brief History of Eternity. It's one of my obsessions. People had asked me before, what do you think it's like to die? I said, it's probably a lot like landing at the Miami airport. You leave everything behind, and all of a sudden, here's a whole new place that you didn't expect, full of people that you didn't know. Perhaps with people that you do know. But in many ways, childhood is something from which we are all exiled. And learning to die is not a grim thing, it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. I think learning to die gracefully, learning to let go, that's another important and powerful theme in this book. It's all about learning to let go. And learning not to mourn for what has been lost, not even to mourn for the life that was lost, but actually to focus on what has been gained. And that's throughout the book, incident after incident. The book has this kind of philosophical, if you want to even call it religious theological theme, that in fact one can learn much from children. One can learn much from the experience of immigrants. That in fact those of us who are fortunate enough not to have to leave our places of birth, either as children or as adults, those are, I said us, I can't count myself among them. Those who lose their place of birth can have a lot to teach us. But in this case, as in the case of Waiting for Snow in Havana, I wrote straight from memory. I did no research whatsoever. Wonderful thing, not to have to do research. As I often say, doing research, compared to this, it's comparing climbing Mount Everest with a 80-pound backpack to a walk in the park. It's nice and flat. But I constantly thought about what memory is as I was writing this book. Where is that past? Where is it? And of course, I'm not the first to ask this question. St. Augustine asked the same question in his Confessions. He too was obsessed with time and with memory. What is the past? What is memory? Where is that? Where are those images that I accessed? Those words I accessed? And actually somebody asked me this evening about the Spanish words that are interspersed in here. my reply, those words came as I was writing, and they came back as Spanish, not English. Where is all that stuff, and what does that mean, and what's our connection to the past, and what's the difference between our memories and history? And here I have to cut to a somewhat serious subject, which is the fact that the reason I wrote Waiting for Snow, the reason I wrote Learning to Die, is so I could tell the history of my people. Not the history that you read about in the newspapers or magazines, or the history you see on shows on television, all of which is curiously skewed, and in many cases, incorrect. I've spent my entire time in the United States, from Everglades Elementary School until this day, correcting the blank spots, filling in the blank spots, and correcting ignorance about Cuba and what has happened in Cuba. Both of these books are sins to my profession on one level. A historian of late medieval and early modern Europe is not supposed to write about himself or about his own history, much less to do it without footnotes. I've committed the ultimate sin for an academic. I've become a dilettante, or not serious. And I'm not joking. My very first tenure case, okay, I have just been tenured. I'm sitting for the very first time on the other side of the curtain, where the wizard has always been. And I'm seeing how tenure is decided. One of my best friends is coming up for tenure, and he's a historian too. First meeting, first hand up. One of my idiot colleagues says, "He's not serious." The man who's up for tenure. "He's not serious. Look, he's published poetry. Look at the CV. He's actually put poetry on the CV. He's not serious." And it wasn't junk poetry either. It was in good poetry journals too. That was my vision of the real wizard, how it works. The awful sin of being a dilettante and not committing yourself 100% to footnoted history. However, I think I can say, with a great peace of mind, these two books are probably the best history I've ever written. This is eyewitness history. In my own work, I have often used first-person accounts. They're wonderful. Nothing can get you back to the past better, in every sense, better. More deeply, more immediately, more surely than a first-person account. However, I was trained this way and learned that it's absolutely true. You can't trust first-person accounts in the same way that you can trust certain documents, like documents I spent many years working with, last wills and testaments from the 16th century. Get you to the past a different way, not so immediate, but those can be trusted because those are legal documents, and that's what people left behind to their heirs. People who write from first person have a tendency to make themselves look better, as happened with Oprah's author, forget his name, James something? Fry, yeah. Or you don't remember things correctly. In addition to not just making yourself look better, you have only one side of the story to tell. So many times I fell on my knees in my study and thanked the people whose first-person accounts I was using, and at the same time that I thanked them, I said, "Thank you, but I can't trust you." But here I did this, and I had to think long and hard about what it is to bear eyewitness to history. The airlift that brought me here and the other 14,000 children was barely covered in the news back in the 1960s. I just want to see a show of hands. How many of you who were alive in 1960 to 1962 knew that this was going on, that these thousands of children were... That's more hands than I usually get. Per capita, right? Not just some... Quite often there's only a couple of hands in the room, or none at all. It was not a well-kept secret, but it wasn't covered. The minute we arrived, we got dispersed, all 14,000 of us. we got sent to 40 different states, and never in very large numbers. We were sent in very small numbers to this place. Overall, a very good thing. I'm immensely grateful for it and everything it did for me. However, the flip side, the darker side, is why parents felt forced to do this. And not only that, why the Cuban government was complicit in all this, and why they prevented the parents from reuniting with the children later. That is the worst injustice. Willfully prevented parents from reuniting with their children, thousands of them. And one has to ask oneself the question, why would the parents of 14,000 children be willing to do this? And the number is even more shocking when you consider the airlift ended in October of '62. Fallout from the missile crisis. For me, the only fallout from the nuclear war that never happened. Fidel Castro shut the door and nobody could leave. And the parents of most of us were still trapped. My mother had an exit permit for November 7th. I was looking forward to vandalizing homes on October 31st and a week later being reunited with my mother. But it didn't happen. They stood in her way repeatedly. They stood in my father's way, and I never saw him again. So I'm bearing witness to this great injustice, which people don't know about. I still run into people repeatedly, and some of you in this room might think the Cuban Revolution is a good thing, and that Fidel and Raul Castro have done wonderful things for the Cuban people. But believe me, none of you in this room would want to live there. As Cubans, not as tourists. Why would 14,000 children be sent away by their parents? Because they were afraid they were losing their children already. This is what that system does. It takes your children away from you the moment they are born. And it's still that way 52 years later. The so-called free education is never free. As I told a class of 5th and 6th graders last Thursday, anybody ever tells you something is free, run away from it. Because nothing is ever free. All school children in Cuba have to spend the greater part of the summer doing slave labor in the countryside. Agricultural work for no pay. I don't care what your definition of slavery is, mine is you work and you don't get paid. And you're forced to do it because you can't say no. You cannot. By 1960 and 1961, it was clear there was religious persecution. Many of our parents sent us here because of explicit religious persecution. It was made clear to us. Anyone, any child that attends religious services, or even worse, religious instruction, can forget about their free education past the age of 16. They can also end up in even more uncomfortable circumstances. The older children were being sent to Prague and Moscow and Berlin and all the wonderful places that were then behind the Iron Curtain. And every Cuban knew some other Cuban whose child, older, was already behind the Iron Curtain. Add this fuel to the fire. The population of Cuba in 1960 was still heavily Spanish. Spanish immigrants. My grandparents were Spanish immigrants. Population of Cuba in 1900, when it achieved independence from Spain, so 1902. Population of Cuba was 2 million. Between 1900 and 1930, 1 million Europeans migrated to Cuba. And most of them were Spanish. And most of them have families that lived through the Spanish Civil War, and they knew of the thousands of Spanish children that had been taken by the communists, sent to Russia, and never seen again. So this was very real threat, parents said. So, from memory, I bear witness to this. It happened to me. It happened to my brother. Our parents felt they had no other choice but to send us away, knowing fully they might never see us again, as in fact did happen with my dad. So, what's my ethical obligation as a historian? To do research on recondite subjects which I love to do, or to bear witness to this history, which is overlooked or sometimes actually falsified. For instance, I don't know how many of you saw the CNBC documentary on the Pedro Pan airlift. Any of you see CNBC Escape from Havana? Not many. Oh, wow. I thought everyone in America had seen it. Check it out. It's available on the web. Escape from Havana. They told the incorrect story. They said the airlift was entirely a CIA plot. Again, the big bad CIA tricking those stupid Cubans who don't know any better. So, many people have said this. I think Elie Wiesel has said it most eloquently. Anyone who witnesses an injustice and doesn't speak up about it, bear witness to it, is helping to keep that injustice alive. Not only that, even worse, justifying that injustice through their silence. So that's why I write books without footnotes, and that's what Learning in Miami is all about. It's about bearing witness. And bearing witness to what? Bearing witness to the fact that there is a place only 90 miles from Key West where the citizens have absolutely no rights whatsoever and live as slaves, still 52 years later. Guess what percentage of the Cuban population has access to the internet? 1.7. The only place with less internet access, I think, is Korea. In Cuba, you can be arrested for owning a copy of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, just for starters. And this place is still there, and some people think it's wonderful. 2 million people, in fact, last year traveled to Cuba as tourists to have fun in the sun. Completely segregated, separated from Cubans, with access to all sorts of things and rights and privileges that are not available to Cubans. An apartheid, in my mind, even worse than what you had in South Africa. Because this apartheid treats tourists better than the people who live in the country. So, not to get too serious on you, this is what the books are about. But it's also about childhood. And as I said before, it's also about immigration, exile, adapting, learning how to be born again. But now, I'll close with this, an anecdote. Memory can be faulty. I made many mistakes in my first book. I've made some in this. Mistakes, honest mistakes. My memory is different from other people's. People remember things differently. My most shocking example from the first book was the fact that in the last chapter I say that none of my friends came to say goodbye to me. But in fact, in 2004, I think shortly after I spoke here, I got an email from someone in Paris who was my neighbor, a boy my age, Miguel Sales, Miguelito, writes me from Paris and says, "Hi, let's reconnect." I meet him in Paris because I'm going to a conference in Paris. Providence works in strange ways. A month later, I'm in Paris and we meet, and the first thing he asks me is, "Do you remember me being at the airport?" And I had to say with great shame on me, "I'm sorry, I just remember that time we had a fight and I hit you in the face and your head knocked against the telephone pole," and he started crying, and then I started crying. I said, "Thanks for reminding me, I don't remember that." But then he adds, "It's very strange that you don't remember me being at the airport to say goodbye to you, because that was the day that changed my life. That was my first step towards prison. Because it was at that airport that Miguel, 11 years old, for the first time began to think there was something wrong with the so-called revolution, separating families like this. And by age 18, he was in prison for saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. He would end up spending 8 years in prison. 6 of them totally naked. Because in Cuba they put political prisoners in cells with criminals and give them the same uniform. So this was his way and the way other political prisoners retained their dignity. But anyway, here an event changes somebody else's life and I don't remember it. So that taught me the limits of memory. Funny thing too, not only the fact that this sent him to prison, the fact that he gave me all the details that proved to me that he was there. Because to this day, I do not remember him being there. No matter how hard I search my memory, he's not there. Yet he gave me the details even down to who rode in which car. And he was right. And we hadn't seen each other in 40-some years. So memory does work the right way sometimes. So anyway, crossroads I'm at, crossroads I've been at for several years. Do I continue writing footnoted books that take 10 years to research? I'm now 60. 10 years a book. Well, if God is good to me, I have 2 more. Because by that time, I guess, no one gives you access to the library. They think you'll lose the books. Or do I write more books like this, which are easy and fun, and actually get a response and actually get read? People thank you for them. No one ever thanked me for one academic book. I've received thousands of thank yous for these books. But anyway, this is the anecdote. I'm at a crossroads. So in Paris, I'm at this conference. And we're having dinner after I'd given what I thought was a very good paper. And conversation stops suddenly because someone with very bad manners said to someone else that I had won the National Book Award in the United States. And that's a conversation stopper in any situation, but amongst scholars who don't know what book that is when they're supposed to know all your work. Woo. So they ask me, I tell them what the book is, and a colleague sitting right across from me looks at me with great pain. It was like this, he winces. He makes a sound just like the one that one of my customers made when I was a newspaper boy. And I threw the newspaper on the porch and I hit him on the chest. It's something like, "Ooh." You know what this means, he says. And he points, he says, you're going to be remembered for that book, not for your scholarly work. And I said, I can live with that. But then the French historian who organized the conference immediately, as only a French historian can, put it all into context immediately for me with great alacrity and no small amount of cruelty. He said, well, you certainly won't win a prize for the paper you gave us today. And lo and behold, this is what I'm closing with, lo and behold, that paper, it's the only paper, well, eventually it was published, it's the only paper, scholarly work of mine that I have ever received thank yous for. Because I think some of this writing spilled over, became more human, more personal in some way. So there is something to the switching over, but my dilemma has not changed. I'm at a crossroads, and I just wish I could be on both roads at once. But it's a hard choice, which one. I still love my research. Just so I can bore you to death in closing, these are the projects I have lined up. I'm writing a survey of the Reformation, about 80% finished. Writing a book on attitudes towards miracles in the 16th and 17th century, especially 2 kinds of miracles, levitation and bilocation. And also a history of atheist martyrs, because the files of the Inquisition in Spain are filled with hundreds of cases of individuals who said, in the 16th century, there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, this is all there is. And they were given the chance to say, come on, just say that you believe. And they refused. And died as martyrs for their unbelief, which to me is the ultimate proof that unbelief is a belief. So I'll end with that. And